Hello everyone, Professor Chris Look here. So today we're going to take a deeper look than we have so far at the US Constitution. Kind of where it came from, what it is, why it matters to us, and what it means to us and for us today. So we know that the Constitution is more than 2 centuries old, but it still shapes every aspect of our lives today. So, of course, it is the foundations, the roadmap, the rule book, the guardrail of the American political system. So it's worth us spending a little bit more time thinking about the Constitution. Even though it's so old, it still shapes every aspect of American politics, government, and laws. So by the end of this lecture, by the end of this discussion, hopefully you have a little better understanding of the Constitution, where it came from, its histories, its structures, and why it matters today. Okay, so let's start with this simple question, like we could hear in a classroom setting of what is the Constitution? Most people will say it's the supreme law of the land. I oftentimes, and you've probably heard me say, that it is the roadmap, the guardrails of the country, of the American political system. And that's true. Every law, every policy, every government action is ultimately judged by the Constitution. If you're reading the news, if you're watching the news, if you're following the news on social media, you hear debates and you're exposed to debates over, is this constitutional? Is that constitutional? How does this fit within the American political system and the constitutional system that we live in? But the Constitution's also more than that. It's this framework for how democracy works. It's this framework with how our democracy works. It establishes our institutions. It divides power among different levels and branches of government. This idea of federalism, which we'll dig into deeper in other videos. But this idea of checks and balances, these rules of the road are built into the US Constitution. And it sets our rights and protections for individuals, sets them in stone. It makes it concrete about protections that citizens have. So we do know that other countries have molded their constitution off of the US's. So we see this in a place like Russia, where if you look at their constitution, it doesn't look that much different than ours. And so we know that constitutions are these guiding principles and frameworks that a country sets out to hopefully abide by. So, to understand why the Constitution was created, we probably should step back into the colonial era. The American colonists had long traditions of self-government, things like town meetings in New England, which we talked about when we talked about direct democracy, and these groups that came together to think about how should we and how will we govern, or colonial assemblies in Virginia. But they were also under British rule, and Britain imposed taxes and trade restrictions the colonists increasingly resented. So the Declaration of Independence in 1776 was a break from Britain. It wasn't just about taxes, it was also about the idea of natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the belief that governments exist to protect these rights. After independence, the first governing framework was the Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1781. The Articles created a pretty weak national government. There was no president, no power for the central authority to tax, no power to regulate commerce. The government instead relied on the states for money and manpower. Not surprisingly, this framework struggled. The articles were weak. coming out of this era where there was a strong king, an overridingly centralized power under the king, the writers of the articles wanted a weak central government because that's what their experience had shown them. But when they created the system that had a very weak central power, it became evident that this was problematic. With the most vivid example was Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 87. When farmers in Massachusetts rose up against the economic hardship and debts that they had incurred. The national government had little ability to respond. Instead, Massachusetts had to ask its neighbors, and they declined. They declined to help. So Massachusetts was kind of on its own. And so they did eventually squelch the uprising, but it showed the weakness of the articles. What happens when you don't have that strong central authority that can maintain law and order, maintain peace? So that crisis convinced many leaders that a strong framework was actually needed, a stronger framework that built a central authority. So we move ahead to the Constitutional Convention. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. The design was to revise the Articles, but what they actually did was far more radical, a far bigger change, which was they entirely wrote the Constitution, a new Constitution, instead of just reworking the Articles. The convention was full of promises. Large states wanted compromises, full of compromises. Large states wanted representation based on population. Makes sense. If you have a lot of population, well, then you want representation at the national level to be based on population. Conversely, understandably, small states wanted equal representation. The result was the Great Compromise, a bicameral legislature, with the House based on population and the Senate giving us 2 Senate seats. So we can think about how that still plays a role today. This dynamic that we experience daily in American politics between bigger states and smaller states, in representation in the House of California versus Delaware, versus in the Senate when we think of South Dakota with 2 senators and Texas with 2 as well. So this compromise of how government will be structured based on, is it just every state's equal versus is it rooted in population? So we see these discussions, these arguments at the Philadelphia Convention of how do we build a better government? How do we structure a government that states feel that their citizens are being represented in? Slavery, of course, was another dividing line. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation. Northern states didn't. The compromise was to count each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation purposes. It's a bit of a stark reminder that the Constitution was not perfect. And it was a product of its time. So we hear this debate today over, is the Constitution evolving? Is it a dead document? Is it a living document? So we see how changes in the Constitution because it wasn't perfect at the time. And so we see changes in evolution of the document today. So another compromise gave Congress the power to regulate commerce, but prohibited banning the slave trade until 1808. These deals show that the Constitution wasn't, like I said, a finished product handed down from above, but it was instead hammered out through negotiation, bargaining, and political reality, and evolving over time, which we hear debates and discussions today about should the Constitution further evolve? Is the Constitution the way it was created and morphed over time? Is it up to the challenges of today? Debates that we encounter in American politics all around us. Okay, so let's move forward again. So then, what is the Constitution? We know it was ratified in 1788 and went into effect in 1789. Structurally, it has a preamble. We've all heard it since we were little kids. We the people, which sets out the purpose of government. The first three articles establish the three branches: the legislative, the executive, the judiciary. Later articles addressed federalism, the amendment process, and the supremacy of federal law. Things that maybe we hear about as being in the Constitution. But again, the Constitution is laying out the roadmap, laying out the rules of the road for how our governing system will work. So early on, many Americans were skeptical about whether the Constitution protected individual freedoms. That's why the Bill of Rights was added in 1791. Those first 10 amendments guarantee things that we hear about all the time: the freedom of speech, religion, freedom of press, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to a fair trial, the right to bear arms, and more. Things that we've encountered and we hear about, whether we're watching our favorite television show which talks about these rights, or if we just hear about them when we are watching the news. These rights built into our governing system that maybe we take for granted. So over time, we know that the Constitution has been amended 27 times, addressing everything from slavery to voting rights to presidential term limits. So we know the Constitution's role, the roles of the road. So why does it matter? So why is the Constitution so important? At its core, it gives legitimacy to government authority. It creates a system of checks and balances, making sure one branch of government, one part of government, isn't getting too strong, isn't getting too powerful. So the Constitution is designed to make sure one branch doesn't dominate. It, as we see, protects individual rights, ensuring that even unpopular minorities retain protections. It enshrines the role of law. No leader, not even the president, is above the law, at least the way the Constitution is structured. And it serves as a symbol for national identity. In a time of crisis, people turn to the Constitution as the foundation of what America is supposed to be. So when we think about these core principles, several of these principles are at the heart of the Constitution. First, it is popular sovereignty. Power rests with the people. Second is federalism. And we'll dig deeper, as I said, we'll dig deeper into federalism as we move along. But authority is divided between the national government and the states. There are these multiple layers of governance. So the closer to home, the closer to where you are, you're probably engaged a bit more with the government structure. And you have those abilities to run for offices at a local level. Federalism builds this layers of government, and so we'll dig deeper into that throughout the year. So federalism, again, we brought up this idea of the separation of powers, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches that have relatively distinct functions. We do see that there is some overlap and debate if there's overlap, but the Constitution lays out the roles of the road for these branches of government. This idea of checks and balances, each branch can limit the other, so one, in theory, doesn't become too strong. And when we think about what is the role of the Constitution in today's America, I don't know. That's debated. We know that's debated. Some people argue it should read as a living document, adaptable to modern circumstances. Others argue for originalism, interpreting it as the framers intended in 1787. The debate plays out constantly in the courts and in public discourse. So contemporary issues bring these tensions into focus, as we talked about in class. Issues like freedom of speech on social media, the scope of the Second Amendment, debates over abortion, debates over privacy, conflicts of federal versus state laws and authority. Every one of these issues requires interpretation of constitutional principles. In fact, the Constitution is often at the center of our political polarization and political issues. Questions like whether states can legalize marijuana despite federal laws saying it is illegal, or whether states can set their own immigration enforcement policy. Things we hear about in the news every day. These things all show how federalism and constitutional authority are contested and discussed today in our current political environment. So the U.S. Constitution, as we know, is the oldest written national constitution still in use. It has inspired, like we said at the outset, it has inspired countless other nations through many modern constitutions are much more detailed. So we do see some constitutions are much longer than the U.S.'s Constitution that touch on many, many little pieces of society. The U.S. Constitution is relatively broad, and so that does leave some room for interpretation, but it also maybe leaves room for it to fit modern contexts well. So part of its endurance comes from this balance of rigidity and flexibility. Amending the Constitution is difficult, but it is possible. Interpretation comes through the courts and allows it to evolve without constant formal changes. And it has enormous symbolic power. Every president, judge, and members of Congress, for the most part, swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution. That symbolic oath reminds us that the Constitution is more than just paper. This is the bedrock of American democracy. So, to just conclude, because I like to keep my videos under 20 minutes. So to conclude, the Constitution emerged out of historical necessity and political compromise. It defies the powers and the limits of government, the limitations on government. It protects rights and it protects liberties. It continues to shape political conflicts today, court cases today, and debates about freedom and equality. It matters because it is not just a relic of the past. It is alive in every political debate we have today. When we ask whether a law is fair, whether a government action is legitimate, or whether our rights are being respected, we are asking, what does the Constitution allow and what does it protect? So kept it under 20 minutes. We could dig deeper into the Constitution, everything here, the amendments. These are all things that we will dig in throughout the next 15 weeks. So thank you.